So today we are starting part 3 of Unit 2, which is all about quadrilaterals. So today we're starting lesson 15-1, which is going to talk about kites in triangle midsegments. So make sure you have your book. We are on page 205. You have some new vocab coming, so make sure you have the vocab sheet for this section. And let's get started. So the term quadrilateral, which sometimes is abbreviated as quad, okay, just means it is a polynomial that has 4 sides. So like this figure here, GEOM. So when we start talking about things like opposite sides or consecutive sides, what they're talking about are this, if it's sides opposite, that just means it's whatever side is across. Sides that are across from each other. So for example, if I look at this side, GE, the side opposite that would be MO. So those would be opposite sides. If we look at another one, if we have EO, for example, if we look at EO, the side opposite him would be GM. That's what it means to be an opposite side. So there's your pairs there of opposite sides. We also have what's called consecutive sides. So let's erase this. So consecutive sides just means sides that are next to each other. Okay. So for example, if I look at my picture, again, let's start with maybe GE. Side that is next to GE could be EO, but another side next to GE could also be GM. So those are all consecutive sides. We also have our side MO, and the side next to MO could be EO. And also MO next to that is also GM or MG. Okay, so those are all of our consecutive and opposite sides. Now, just like with sides, we can also have opposite and consecutive angles. So what I'm going to have you guys do is C, D, and E here. So in C, they want you to list the opposite angles. So just pick an angle and name all the sides opposite of it. Pick an angle and list all the ones that are consecutive or next to it. And then E says draw the diagonals and then list the names of our diagonals. Okay, so go ahead and try C, D, and E for me on your own. Okay. So there's our opposite angles. G and O are across from each other, and so are M and E. Consecutive angles, so G and M are next to each other, but so are G and E. M and O are next to each other, but so is M, O, and E. Okay, those are all mean next to. If we draw in our diagonals here, let me just draw these really quick. Diagonals would go across from side to side. So our diagonals there would be GO and ME. That's how we could name them. We could also have it flipped, okay, OG and EM, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so let's go to our first quadrilateral we're going to learn about, and that is what is called a kite. A kite is a quadrilateral with exactly 2 distinct pairs of congruent consecutive sides, so sides that are next to each other. So for example, this kite, it's labeled KITE. Okay, in this kite, your 2 consecutive sides would be KI and KE, and those would be congruent. So would IT and ET. Those sides are also congruent. Okay, so you have 2 distinct pairs of congruent consecutive sides. Okay. We also have a list of other properties down here in part C that are very important. So you want to make sure you know all 6 of these properties of a kite. So we just talked about how 2 pairs of those sides are congruent. The other one says one diagonal cuts the kite into 2 congruent triangles. So let me show you what that means. If I take a line here, and let's say I just use this color. If I cut it through, so that diagonal KT, then we have 2 congruent triangles here. We have triangle KIT, and that would be congruent to triangle KET. Okay, so it gives us 2 congruent triangles. So that is another property of a kite. The third property of a kite is the diagonal of a kite are perpendicular. So I already drew one diagonal in, but let's draw in the other diagonal. So it's not very straight, but that's okay. So the two diagonals here, if we have these, we have those two diagonals are going to be perpendicular. So we can draw in then those little square boxes there that are showing us that those are perpendicular. Okay. Okay, next we have, let's look at number 4. Now I'm going to make this a big screen so we can see the picture and the properties together. So the next one we have here is number 4, where it says the diagonal divides the kite into two isosceles triangles. So let me move part of this here if I can. I move that diagonal here. So if I look at this diagonal with IE, we can see we have two isosceles triangles. You have triangle IKE has two congruent legs. And then you have triangle ITE with also two congruent legs. So two isosceles triangles. Those are not congruent. They're two different triangles, but they are both labeled as isosceles. Let's look at property number 5. One pair of opposite angles are congruent. So let me move this out of here and this one back in. Okay, so remember that diagonal KT divided us into two congruent, I'm going to erase all this, divided us into two congruent triangles. So when that's the case, remember we have corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So these opposite angles, angle I and angle E, have to be congruent then in order to fit that criteria. So that's what they mean by property 5. One pair of opposite angles are congruent. And again, that's because of our property with CP, CTC. And that kind of goes along with number 2. Okay. The last property we know about kites is that one diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. So let me put, so if we look at this diagonal here, KT, it's going to bisect angle K and it's going to bisect angle T. So meaning this angle gets bisected and so does angle T. Gets bisected. Okay, similarly with our other diagonal here, okay, that would also bisect these angles. So those and those. Okay, so it does bisect your angles as well. Okay. All right, so that is all we know about a kite. So it's very important that you know these kind of 6 rules here, okay, that are all of our properties of a kite. So this is very important. So make sure you have all these written down somewhere where you can reference them later. All right. So now let's look at what it means to be a mid-segment. So this is a big part of today's lesson. A segment whose endpoints are the midpoints of two sides of a triangle is called a mid-segment. So what that means is in this triangle here, ABC, this line MN is a mid-segment. So that makes points M and N midpoints. Okay? The mid-segment of a triangle is parallel to the third side, and its length is 1/2 the length of the third side. So we'll get into that in a second. But if we have midpoints here, that means these sides are going to have to be congruent, BM and AM. Same thing with BN and CN. They're midpoints. It gives you two congruent parts. Okay. Now this triangle mid-segment theory, what we have to know here is that what it's saying is the mid-segment of a triangle is parallel to the third side. So these sides are going to be parallel to each other. Okay. And its length is 1/2 the length of the third side. So what that means is MN is 1/2 the length of AC. Okay. If it's a mid-segment of a triangle. So I know we were done with triangles, but this is the only actually thing with triangles that we're going to do now. So the mid-segment is 1/2 of that third side, so that side up beneath it, the longer side. Okay. So what I'm going to do is let's just talk about these problems right here. So if M is the midpoint, it's the midpoint of AB. Okay. N is the midpoint of BC. We know if they are a midsegment that MN has to be parallel to the third side, AC. And MN is going to be 1/2 of AC. So whatever the AC length is, your midsegment will be half the distance. Okay, so let's put this to some practice on the next page here. Let's look at question 8. So question 8 says DE is parallel to AC. So let's mark that. Is DE a mid-segment of triangle ABC? So look at how that triangle is labeled. So we know that they're parallel, but think about what else we know about mid-segments. Does that make DE a mid-segment? What we know from this picture and what we were given. Okay, the answer is no. Okay, if this was a mid-segment, that means points D and E have to be midpoints. Well, there's no congruence here. 5 and 6 are not the same measure. Okay, so those would not be midpoints. Okay, so it's not a mid-segment. Okay, let's just jump down here to this lesson practice problems and do a couple more problems. So it says XY is a mid-segment of the triangle DEF. So we know for sure it's a mid-segment. So let's talk about what that means then. If that's the case, then I know that these points are midpoints of the line. So Y is the midpoint of DF. X is the midpoint of DE. So let's look really quick here. We know, okay, if we have to find, let's start with DX. Okay, if XE is 6 and X is the midpoint, what is DX? Similarly with YF, if you know that DY is 4 and Y is the midpoint, what is DF? Ooh. Went too far there. Spoiler alert. Okay, if those are truly mid-segments, that means we have the same side. So this side would have to be okay, 6, and this side would have to be 4. 6 and 4. Now, if it's the mid segment, that means this length, XY, would have to be half of 17, which is how I got the answer of 8.5. Okay. Let's try another one here. It says QR is the mid segment of this triangle WYZ. Find each measure. So we're going to find what X is and then find the length of WZ and QR. So this one's an algebraic one. So in this problem, we know that QR is your mid-segment. Just kind of draw here. So remember, QR is going to be half of what our third side is, so WZ. So it's going to be half of this. So see if you could solve that for X. So let me maybe help you set it up a little bit further. If QR, we know the, let me just do it over here. So QR we know is 2x minus 2.5. We know that has to be equal to 1/2 WZ, which is 2x plus 7. So go ahead and solve that for X and see what you get. Okay, if you did this correctly, you should have gotten that X was 6. Okay, you could have distributed that 1/2 if you wanted to. You could multiply it out on both sides to get rid of it. That might be easier. Multiply this side by 2 and this side by 2. That gives you 4x minus 5 is equal to 2x plus 7. And then if you move your x's to one side, that would give you 2x. Move your constants over, equal to 12. So x is 6. So as x is 6, what does that make WZ and QR? Which should make them 19 and 9.5. Okay, so knowing the properties of a mid-segment, again, is very important. The mid-segment cuts each segment into half because the points will be your midpoints. And then also knowing that the mid-segment is half of the third side of your triangle, so half of the longest side. Okay, let's just look at one more question about kites. Figure ABCD is a kite with diagonals BD and AC. So let's fill in the rest of this problem. So if we have BD, we know that that's perpendicular to the other diagonal. So that means it's perpendicular to AC. Okay. Remember, your diagonals cut your kite into two congruent triangles. So if we have triangle ABC, that's congruent to which triangle? Will be triangle ADC, the one across from it. If we have congruent triangles, we know corresponding parts are going to be congruent. So if we have angle ABC, that would be congruent to the opposite side, ADC. Okay, next part, if we have, let me erase all this. If we have AB, that's congruent to which other corresponding side? It'd be BD. And lastly, if we have angle BAC, angle BAC, what angle is that congruent to? Remember, the diagonals give you bisectors. So if we have this angle here, it's going to be bisected, making the next one congruent. So that means angle DAC is congruent. Okay, so the two main takeaways today are the mid-segment theorem of a triangle. So knowing that those cross at midpoints of each segment, and the mid-segment is half of the third side of the triangle. The other big part of today's lesson is those 6 properties of the kites that you want to make sure you know. So there they are. Okay. All right, so we'll go over some more problems together in class, but that is our first section of the quadrilaterals unit.